The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor travel guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello everyone, it's Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide here, and welcome to this episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. Now this is a very special episode which is being recorded on location in Greenwich, and so as we move around you may well hear noises and sounds of life going on, and I hope this just simply adds to the atmosphere and so that you too can feel that you are here in Greenwich as we follow in the footsteps of Anne Boleyn from her arrest at Greenwich on the 2nd of May through to her arrival at the Tower. And to do so, I have managed to escape the confines of COVID, and I am standing here on the site of one of the greatest Tudor palaces that ever existed, of course, Greenwich Palace. But I am not alone today because I have a very special guest joining me. And may I therefore introduce James Peacock. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. It's an honour to be here.
Now, James, you are the founder of the Anne Boleyn Society, so nobody better to be with me here today.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a real honour to hear that. Thank you.
So what we're going to try and do, I think, is kind of a combo of talking about the palace that used to exist here on site, and then also starting to recount the events which really kicked off on that infamous May Day joust and the subsequent arrest of Anne Boleyn on the 2nd of May. So I was thinking for the listeners, maybe if we start just by thinking a little bit about the history and how this palace came to be here.
Sure.
Now, it might be useful actually, because I love painting pictures, to talk about actually where we're standing. So we're in a rather large open space here. What maybe you could say something about what you see around you, and maybe I'll pick it up from there.
Oh, well, we've got the Thames just to our left here, and it's a beautiful sunny day, I have to say, as well, which is absolutely lovely.
Aren't we lucky?
Yes. And we've basically got two large buildings on either side of us here. A sort of pathway, large pathway I should say, in the middle. There's steps going up and everything. It's quite a scenic atmosphere, but of course none of it is Tudor.
None of it.
which is such a shame for us Tudor fans and everything. None of it is Tudor. I mean, beautiful buildings, but unfortunately, none of it is Tudor. Yeah,
so this was the Royal Naval College, I believe, built around in the 18th century, I think.
Yes, I believe some of it was started up in William and Mary's time, I think, so late 1600s. I know that's when the painted halls. So late 17th
century and into the 18th century. I did happen to notice a slight clue. It had George Rex III on one of the buildings, so that helps us date this. But of course, as you say, the Royal Palace was completely torn down and lost, largely as a result of the Civil War, when of course many of the great royal palaces were left to go into a state of decay. And of course these buildings soon deteriorated and fashions changed.
And I think Greenwich had I think it had actually stopped being used as a royal palace by this point as well. Before then, it kind of, I get the feeling it kind of fell out from Elizabeth's reign onwards. It sort of fell out of use as a royal palace as such.
And then the English Civil War came along in the 1640s and it really sealed its fate.
It did,
But of course the original palace here dates back into the medieval period, and we certainly had a manor house on this site that was owned by Duke Humphrey, and we are kind of looking out. We've got the Thames behind us, and then we're looking southwards through the buildings, as you mentioned, towards Greenwich Park, which is much smaller than the Greenwich Park of times gone by, of course, when the royalty would have been out there hunting. But on the top of the hill of Greenwich Park, we today have the Royal Observatory, but back in the day, that was where Duke Humphrey's Tower was sighted. So anyway, to cut probably a longer story short, Henry VII came along, took a shine to this palace, which he called the Place of Plaisance, and began to remodel and rebuild a grand Tudor red brick palace as befitting a royal status, and hence we ended up with the palace that the Tudors came to know and love. But quite a few major events happened in this spot. Maybe you just want to touch on a few of those births and so on and so forth.
Well, one of the key things, I think, from Greenwich Palace is the fact that we have 3 of our Tudor monarchs are all born here at Greenwich. So you've got Henry VIII, who's born here. Then his daughter Mary is born here in 1516. And, of course, Anne Boleyn gives birth to her daughter Elizabeth here in 1533. And then, of course, you also have a death of a Tudor monarch as well here. Edward VI dies here in about 1553. So there's some quite key events that are happening in Greenwich Palace, and there's a couple of marriages as well. Obviously, when I say marriages, I mean Henry VIII's marriages, a couple of his many marriages.
So Anne of Cleves.
I think Catherine of Aragon as well, I think.
So I love coming to Greenwich because despite the fact the palace is lost, as you have just said, there are so many significant events that if you bring your imagination with you and you know a little bit about how the palace looked, it's very atmospheric to me. And I think today of all days, when we're here to follow in the footsteps of Anne Boleyn through those really tumultuous, dramatic events, it's actually quite moving, don't you think?
It's incredibly moving. So obviously today being the 20th of April that we're recording this, yesterday on the 19th I did a post on my Anne Boleyn Society, and I was basically saying that, you know, it's 1 month from today that Anne Boleyn was executed, so she had 30 days left to live. Obviously now that's 29 days, and to kind of get that message, that point across to people that this was an incredibly quick events, the quick speed at which these events happened. And, you know, at this time, back in 1536, Anne would have had no idea what was coming. In fact, very few, probably if any people, knew what was about to come. And, you know, from the end of April onwards, events moved at the most bewildering speed. And, and that's something I think that people don't often always get when they're researching Anne and stuff. With a lot of the other people we've got who are executed, there's a longer sort of period of time, and it's almost like you click your fingers, she's gone.
She's gone, and that's what makes it so shocking.
It really does. It really does.
So we're going to start telling the story, but I just want to sort of say for the moment about literally where we are. We are in the centre of the old palace, so we would have been standing right now in the centre of the courtyard of the old palace. Now I'm facing now towards the river, and I can see the river today because nothing kind of blocks my view. But in days gone by, that would have been the principal range for the king's lodgings, including the presence chamber, his privy chamber, bedchamber, etc. And then behind me, so if I just turn around, I'm now facing, again, as you described, we've got these sort of 17th, 18th century buildings and this large gap walkway, quite magnificent. But again, back in the Tudor period, I would have been looking at the range of the Queen's lodgings. So literally, I don't know, 50 feet away from where we're standing, 100 foot maybe maximum. It's where a lot of those dramatic events played out, and where Anne had her last taste of freedom.
Yeah. And to think as well, that would have been where she gave birth to one of our most famous monarchs in history, was born there, and nothing stands of those. There's such pivotal events there, and where she was informed that she was going to be arrested, sent to the Tower. That very day on the 2nd of May, which again was less than 3 weeks after that she was executed.
Incredible.
Sorry, I keep emphasising that point there.
No, but it is a huge. It happened at such a bewildering speed. It was a total coup, and I don't know whether you agree with me, James, but I think I align with most historians when I say Cromwell had a lot to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. And I think also, Tracy Borman has done a magnificent biography of Cromwell and gives him a very fair examination of his life. But even she says, well, he is 100% up to his neck in it, basically, in getting rid of Anne. He is the one who put the whole thing together. Whether or not you could say Henry, yes, he must have got the go-ahead from him, but it is his plan to get rid of them all.
Yeah. And he does a magnificent job. And the reason I bring this up here, before we move on with our story, is if we face northwards across the river, somewhere over there was Stepney.
Ah, yes.
And that is, of course, where poor Mark Smeaton was taken to one of Cromwell's, well, in its day, it would have been a country house. Of course, now when you look across the river, what we can see are the skyscrapers of the city of sort of part of the city of London. But in its day, it would have been countryside, and somewhere in a house, poor Mark Smeaton was interrogated, if not tortured. Yeah. And it was the damning evidence, wasn't it, from Mark, that really, really lit the fuse that blew the whole powder keg apart.
Yeah, that's very true. But again, even then, when you've got him being arrested on one day and interrogated, just 2 days later, Anne's being arrested herself. And they're trying to, and one of the things she's told is that 2 men have accused her. Well, that of course wasn't true at all, because only Smeaton had confessed. Now, like you said, that could be under torture. He certainly would have faced a tough interrogation. But the only other man that had been accused at that point was Henry Norris, and he was denying it, of course. But yeah, there is...
Like the gentleman he was.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So with that, we're really setting up the events that were about to go into full flow on the 1st of May. So I think to tell that story, we need to go and stand in the place it happened. So why don't we take a walk through these buildings and try and find the site of the original tilt yard.
Absolutely. Sounds like a brilliant plan, Sarah. As the author of In the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn, that's really what we're doing today.
We are, aren't we? So let's just take a walk, and we're going to be heading southwards, and literally we are now facing, today, Queen Anne's house, which is quite a marvellous, beautiful building, and we can see the observatory up on the hill there of Greenwich Park. And my heart races when I see Greenwich Park because I'm known for my imagination, and I can easily imagine the royal party in happier times racing out across the park to enjoy a day's hunting.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, well, with that, let's go and find that car park.
Absolutely, let's go do that.
So we've just crossed the Romney Road, which currently bisects the site here at Greenwich, but of course didn't exist back in the 16th century, and we're now over on the south side of the palace. Oh my goodness, James, isn't this glorious?
It is absolutely wonderful, and we're so lucky with the weather today. For those outside the UK, the last couple of weeks have been very up and down.
We've had snow.
We had snow.
We've had Arctic winds.
Yes.
And today we have the most glorious spring sunshine.
We really are so lucky.
And I just want to paint a little picture for those of you who are listening. So James and I are sitting, as I say, in the grounds on the far side of what would have been the Greenwich Palace gardens, in fact, very close to where the Tiltyard Towers once stood. And over to our left, today there is a range of buildings, again sort of probably Georgian buildings, but on the other side is a car park, and that is roughly where the site of the Tiltyard was. But in front of us we are looking out over Greenwich Park, and as I said, it is a beautiful day. So the park is littered with people enjoying the spring sunshine, isn't it?
It is. It's really nice to see, and it's just the scenery right now is beautiful. I mean, we'll post. You obviously have to follow us on Instagram and Twitter and everything, because we will post some pictures of this. Well, we probably shared them by now, but
we'll repost them.
We'll repost them.
And I will be doing a show notes page associated with this podcast. So I'll be able to repost some of the images, and we've also taken some videos, so you'll be able to see that. But we've got Greenwich Park rising away in the distance southwards up to the top of the hill, where we've got the Royal Observatory. We've got beautiful trees dotted around, and it's just so easy to imagine what a gorgeous space this must have been back in the Tudor period. So, as I said, next to us, we're very close to the original site of the Tiltyard Towers and the Tiltyard beyond there. So it's time to pick up our story. So do you want to talk a little bit about the events of May the 1st?
Oh, May the 1st. This is where it all really starts to go wrong for Anne. Well, just give a quick little bit of a background in the events leading up to that. By the time May the 1st, obviously we mentioned Mark Smeaton had been arrested and interrogated. Now it seems that Anne must have also had an idea around that time that something was going on, because she sought out her chaplain Matthew Parker and entrusted the care of her daughter Elizabeth's spiritual welfare to him.
So poignant,
I know,
isn't it?
It's incredible. It really is. Should anything happen to her, and this is one of the things I love about that is that you can also then get a tie into Elizabeth and Anne for when Elizabeth becomes queen, because she appoints Matthew Parker as her first Archbishop of Canterbury, and I think that's no coincidence there at all.
I think you're right.
And so I love that sort of connection there you get from that, and he really took that post on because of his duty to Anne. I think he found working with Elizabeth quite difficult at times. But yes.
Didn't he say something like, if it wasn't for the mother?
Yes.
Something along those lines.
Something, if I would not have done this, or something, if I'd not so
bound to the
mother for what she said to just days before her apprehension or something. So yes, he obviously, I think by this point he was probably also getting on a bit as well, and Elizabeth was known for being difficult when she wanted something as well. You know, so yeah, but that's a really nice sort of connection there you can get. But yes, back to the 1st of May. Well, I imagine the weather was a bit like this really. I think it was a nice sunny day. Everyone was all set up for the May Day joust.
And it was a big, this was an annual event. People looked forward, because May Day was all about, we'd been through, English winters can be trying at best of times. It's dark, you've got short days, it's cold. So people were really bursting into the midst of spring and into summer, and people were celebrating fertility and fecundity and rebirth, and it was a great day of celebration at court.
Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, it would have been like you said, a time to look forward. English winters are harsh at the best of times, and definitely in Tudor times, and they really marked that on the 1st of May, the May Day obviously now we just mark it as soon as the sun appears in the skies. But yeah, so everyone would have been set up at court. It would have been it's obviously a very staged event. So everything, it was almost like theatre really, the way it was all set up really in the tilt yard, and there would have been all the different banners fluttering in the breeze. There was a protocol for who would arrive when. The king and queen would then arrive and take their seats, and been filled with courtiers, and the horses would be ready. People would be getting ready to joust and everything before the action took place. And so you've got all that sort of that going on.
Except in the background, obviously from what you were saying, was feeling really anxious.
Yeah.
So you've got all this beauty and pageantry and celebration, and then underneath it, there must have been this simmering tension going on.
Yeah, definitely. So she must have felt very uneasy the whole time. To the wider court, though, it would have looked like everything was normal, and everything would have been, people who weren't in the king's very inner circle. Because once again, I reiterate, and I do apologise for repeating myself, but apart from very few, no one really knew what was about to take place, really, if anything, even then. So there was people, the majority of people were blissfully unaware. They were just ready to celebrate the May Day joust. But like you said, Anne would have felt very unsettled, no doubt, at this point.
And she wouldn't know what was coming or where it was coming from.
She probably felt that, still, if she was to get pregnant soon, and that would be a son, then, and she would have been absolutely safe then. So she probably was hoping that there were to be signs soon that she was pregnant, that her and Henry can now look forward. But obviously, sadly, this wasn't to be.
So as we were saying, the tilt yard towers were here and constructed so that you could get these fabulous views of the countryside around, but also to see what was going on the tilt. And my understanding is that there was an open gallery at sort of first floor level where the king and queen and the closest of the courtiers, noblemen, etc., could sit and enjoy the spectacle of the joust. And as you said, it was theatre, wasn't it? So you had the challengers and the answerers.
Yes.
And, so you had your teams, if you like, that wore their certain colours and heraldry.
Yeah.
And there was all sorts of pomp and circumstance about how they came into the tilt, and, how they, spoke to the king and queen and got permission to do their devoir, which is another word, I think, for the works, French for work, isn't it, devoir? But that was their sort of, I think the way that the kind of term they used for doing the tilt, for doing the charge, etc. So the tilt gets underway and all seems fine, and Sir Henry comes to run at the tilt to do his bit of jousting. But something quite unnerving happens. What's that? Can you tell us about that?
So his horse, possibly sensing the tension in the air, as I think animals are prone to do more than humans really, begins to feel quite nervous in the event and refuses to charge, refuses to move really. And so Henry VIII, the king, steps in and gets one of his own horses for Norris to use, in a rather bizarre act of, well, probably the last act of generosity he would show the man, really,
quite.
ever. And considering what was then to take place, it just adds to the confusion, really, when you think about it, of the whole event.
Yeah, and for me it just adds to the tension, because I really think that horse felt something palpable.
Yes.
It was Henry Norris's own horse, and I would have thought that, horse and rider are very well attuned in relationship, and I suspect that horse picked up on something.
And to be honest, but Henry Norris probably was as well, because it had only been a couple of days since his unfortunate conversation with Anne.
We should talk about that, because that is very relevant, isn't it, to what happened?
Yes.
Tell us more.
So a couple of days before, Anne was in her chambers one day, where she, I believe, asked Henry Norris why he had taken so long to marry
Madge Shelton, her cousin, because he'd seemed to have come a-courting. He was a widow by this stage with 2 children, so one would expect that he would probably want to remarry. So so Anne goes out and says, "Yes, why are you taking so long?" Yes. Then what happens?
And then obviously he tells her that there is someone else that he, that he loves, and he's being courteous obviously to his queen. This is the whole game of courtly love at this point that he's playing. And then Anne says in response, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king, you would look to have me." Now, that's obviously for us, that's almost a bit like, whoa, wait a minute, what's she doing there? But really, Anne's playing the game of courtly love herself and turning it on her head, but by doing so, she's stepping out of the boundaries of the women at the time and sort of taking lead on it, which was a very controversial thing to do back then.
And maybe in another time, another place, it wouldn't have been a problem, but with things being as fraught as they were and everything balanced on a knife edge, there were enemies, there were wolves amassing around the Boleyns. They were waiting to seize on anything they could.
Yeah.
And Anne just handed it to them on a platter.
She did. Unfortunately, it's really unfortunate. And because again, she could have had no idea of what was to come. And this was a case where words were twisted, were taken out of context, were fitted to mean one thing and another for the whole case to go against her, really. Yeah. And by doing that, obviously in hindsight we can look back and say, oh well, that's people could say that's a foolish thing for her to have done, but obviously at the time she would have had no idea that was going to be misconstrued in some way. Had she said that on any other time, it would have been brushed off, absolutely normal. Had she said it back in, the early days of her and Henry's relationship, Henry probably would have laughed it off as well. Yeah. But of course, at that time and that frame of mindset that he was in and what was going on, it's a totally different situation. Yeah. In a way, I guess you could say it was almost, she was playing the game that her daughter would then go on to play with Robert Dudley and her many suitors who were coming for her, and of course she was stepping out of her confines of the womanly role because she was taking the lead, as it were, and that, like what Anne had done with this conversation, was unnatural, really. In that times, it's easy for us to say now, oh well, she made the comment, she made the joke, she whatever people might want to say it, but she obviously in those days, by doing that and taking the lead of this courtly love game, she was stepping out of her.
But that was Anne Boleyn, wasn't she?
That was very much Anne Boleyn. That was very much Anne Boleyn.
Never the shrinking violet.
Yeah, no.
But we're sitting here, as I say, well, yards from where the Tilt-Yard Towers were and that gallery was. And of course, partway through the joust, a message arrives for the king.
And when that message arrives, it informs them of Mark Smeaton's confession the day before, and Henry, without further word, just gets up and leaves the joust.
Never looks back,
and that is the last time he would ever see Anne, and the last time Anne would ever see him.
Oh, I've just had shivers down my spine when you said that, because it's Henry all over. It's how he dealt with these things, but it
also
chilling.
Doesn't help that the sun also went in just at that moment.
It
as
did
well.
Actually, didn't it? Behind a rather dominant black cloud above us. Yes, maybe Anne is present with us as we talk about this. Anne is left alone. The tilt comes to an end, and Henry goes, and of course he calls, doesn't he, for Sir Henry Norris to come with him and confronts Henry.
Yeah. Yes, and he's confronting Henry on sort of accusations of both him with Henry Norris and Anne, and even offers him some sort of pardon, I believe, if Norris confesses. But Norris refuses to confess, and he says absolutely nothing has happened, and swears to Anne's honour. And I think that's rather telling, that despite being offered something, he's actually saying, no, I'm not going to throw her to the walls to save myself. This isn't true at all. And
I don't believe for one moment that Henry wouldn't have then backtracked and thrown Norris into the tower.
No, exactly,
if he'd have admitted for fornication with his wife, it would not have happened.
So Norris probably realised he was
on to a loser either way. Yeah, absolutely. And so, of course, when Henry leaves Greenwich, well, where the king goes, everybody else goes. Yes. So I think people start to leave Greenwich, the noblemen start to follow. And Greenwich, when I was writing about this from the novel I wrote about Anne Le Temps-Viandre, it felt like rats deserting a sinking ship, people just disappearing. But of course, Anne wasn't invited to follow.
No.
So just as when, I suppose, Henry told Catherine of Aragon, away with you.
Yes.
Anne wasn't really given permission or allowed to follow, so she was left here at Greenwich. Must have been utterly bewildered.
Absolutely, and you know, you see the story continue to repeat with Henry, like when he leaves Anne of Cleves and leaves Catherine Howard. You know, he does have that sense that he would just suddenly leave people, even people like Cromwell and Wolsey. You know, when he left people, there was no sort of hint really that anything was wrong. He would suddenly just be gone. And for all of these people, they must have been utterly bewildered then when it all happened. So he obviously wasn't very good at facing the problem head on, or sort of the or any sort of goodbye or anything. But yeah, it's just incredible really to think that after all those years and everything, he's just gone just like that.
So Anne spends the evening at Greenwich, and then of course on the 2nd of May, Henry orders her arrest. And what I thought we might do is walk over to where the tennis courts were thought to be, because that's where supposedly Anne was watching a game of tennis, and maybe we can just pick up the rest of the story.
Absolutely.
Let's go then.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, if you enjoy these podcasts, did you know that you can support my work by becoming a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month? A link to find out more about this programme and the different levels of sponsorship available is included in the description associated with this podcast. And while I can't thank you in person, here's a big mwah to say a massive thank you from me. So now it's back to the show.
So as we're making our way over to the opposite side, south side of what would have been the palace precinct, and somewhere in that region, the tennis courts, where I'm just noticing that we are passing the sort of the central southern exit, and of course that's where the main gatehouse was that led out to Greenwich Park. And there was you can still see today there's a kind of a footpath on the other side, and that track did originally exist in the 16th century, and it was a shortcut towards the London-Dover Road. So people did tend to use it, but I imagine if the King and Queen were heading out across Greenwich Park, the guards would go out there and make sure there was no, sort of riffraff out there to get in the way as the party galloped through. And I'm literally gesturing with my hands. I'm imagining this party heading off on their hunting trip. Now, I'm not sure exactly where the tennis courts were, other than that they were in the south-west corner of the palace precinct. So, can you tell us a little bit about the events of the 2nd of May then, James?
Oh, so 2nd of May. So this is the fateful day then when Anne is going to be arrested. And in the morning, now she, as always with Anne, she's putting on a brave face, as well, despite the events of the previous day, despite how she must have been feeling. And she's with her ladies watching a game of tennis that morning, and she, her champion wins the game, and she regrets not having placed a bet on him to have won some money for his victory.
Because one of the people playing was Urian Brereton, wasn't he? So he was the brother of, unfortunately, one of the men who would come to fall with Anne Boleyn. So a bit of an irony in that.
Yeah, so that would have, the events of May 1536 had ramifications beyond the royal family, as it were, because you know, you had not just the 5 men who were then executed, but you've got their families. And being the 16th century, everyone is related in some way. So everyone was connected to someone. I mean, even Jane Seymour and Anne Boleyn were related. So, you know, everyone had some sort of relation, some sort of loss from this, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So after Anne was arrested, she was commanded to present herself before the Privy Council, which she would never have had to do before in her life, and she must have still been none the wiser, or I don't know whether gossip had got to her by that stage about what was going on. But when she walked into that Privy Council room, she would have been confronted by 3 men, 3 councillors, and that was Paget, Fitzwilliam and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. What happened then?
Well, that's unfortunately when things really do tend to kick off then, and you know, as when she's informed that she's got to go to, you know, the council, she simply presents herself to them. She acts with all sort of graciousness without any act of fear, of course, but that's very typical Anne for what you get when you read about her.
Braver than a lion.
Absolutely, and you know, when she then enters the room, she's informed. Now, this is where she's informed that 2 men had apparently accused her and admitted to having relations with her. This obviously is completely untrue. It's only Mark Smeaton that's allegedly confessed, and even then possibly, whether it's been under pressure or torture of some kind. Norris, as we mentioned earlier, is denying that. So the men are trying to get some sort of confession out of her, but of course Anne is refusing to give them anything, and she later recalls this when she's in the Tower, that she was cruelly handled at Greenwich, possibly from a very unsympathetic uncle, in particular the Duke of Norfolk, who was known for being fairly ruthless and cold-hearted.
Skurbic, wasn't he?
Even with his own children and family. She eventually is sent back to her apartments, where she has lunch and everything is normal, and although she is slightly unnerved when the King's carver, I believe is it, who doesn't arrive to wish her a good meal, you know, does not arrive, and that's obviously a slight concern for her then. But around, I believe it's around 2 in the afternoon, the council return and inform her that she is to be taken to the Tower to be lodged until her trial.
And I think Norfolk reads the charges against her and commands that she's going to be taken to the Tower. And this time we've got, I think, a fuller contingent of the council, including, I think, Thomas Cromwell has pitched up this time to see what's going on.
And she's sat under her canopy of state in her apartments on her throne, and she's not given any time to pack or any belongings or anything. She simply has to leave, and she replies with that if it's if the king wills it, I'm ready to do it. And she simply gets up and heads out to the barge then to.
And she's very, very composed still at this stage, but it must have taken so much for her to be holding it all together. She knew what Henry was capable of, and although of course we've never seen an execution of the Queen, so I can't imagine at that stage. She must have believed at that stage that even if she was to be imprisoned, she would probably be exiled rather than being executed. But nevertheless, the stress must have been enormous on her, but she holds it together and she gets onto the barge and she heads off upstream I should say, towards the Tower. And in fact that is where we're going to go next in our quest to be in the footsteps of Anne Boleyn. We too are going to go down to Greenwich Pier and get on a boat, and we're going to follow Anne upstream to the Tower. So let's pick up our story there. So James, we've come down to Greenwich Pier. Now obviously this is the modern day pier. The old Tudor pier was right out the front of the palace building. In fact, I think you can still see some of the wood, you know, the rotten wood where the pier would have been. But we're here waiting to take us to London Bridge, which apparently on today's clipper, and you can get a clipper, is 10 minutes. 10 minutes, that's amazing, isn't it? And
got the single?
Yes, there's 3 of us.
3, perfect. Thanks very much.
So we're about to get on a clipper that's going to take us up to London Bridge and take us all of 10 minutes to get there, but that wasn't quite how it was for Anne, was it?
For Anne, she had to wait about 3 hours, I think, for her journey from here to the tower, which would have been the most agonising journey, because not only would she had to wait them 3 hours, she also had the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, pestering her the whole time, trying to get her to admit some sort of guilt in the charges that had been laid against her, and she also had Cromwell on the journey as well.
Yes, and wasn't Norfolk going the tut,
Yes.
really trying to rub salt into the wounds?
Where she just, I believe, stared straight ahead or denied anything really. So how she managed to keep her composure and not
with no friends around.
It was hardly the fun party on the boat.
Yeah. Well, our boat is arriving, and for those of you who perhaps want to take this river trip, you can either do the Thames Clipper, which we're using today, which is like the fast commuter boat, or of course in normal non-COVID times there are also the tourist boats available as well, and I'll include links to these in the show notes associated with this podcast. Oh wow, James, that was brilliant. We've just been on a brilliant 10-15 minute trip up the Thames on the Clipper.
I know, that's incredible. That's such a unique experience.
I love it.
Yeah.
What a great way to travel. And I do keep harping on about this, but if you are in London, do remember to hop on a boat and see London from the river, because it's a completely unique perspective. Yeah. But even more exciting, just having got off here at the tower, we were directed to the exit and we find ourselves with a fantastic view of the Queen's Steps, just directly in front of Tower Wharf. Tell us about the relevance of this to Anne's story.
Well, these steps is where Anne arrived on May the 2nd, 1536. Now, we have literally just got on, as you say, we've just gone on the same journey that she would have got on. But obviously, in more modern times, we've taken about 10-15 minutes for what took her about 3 hours, which, as we said before, must be, and that's the boat ride from hell with the company she had. So she would have arrived here roughly around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, evening, I believe. And so, yes, she would have arrived here at the tower by those steps, alighted there, and gone into the tower, and that is pretty much, she would never leave the tower ever again.
That was it. But it's good to be here to bust a myth, isn't it? Because we've got the blocked up entry to Traitor's Gate, and there is this one of those myths that gets propagated that she went in through Traitor's Gate. But she was a queen still, and noble persons, including Elizabeth to follow her, would actually be brought here to the Queen's Steps. Well, we've just come ashore, let's put it that way, up the pier and nearly onto Tower Wharf. Now, unfortunately, here in the UK, although COVID restrictions are easing, a lot of the heritage sites are still closed, and the Tower of London is one of them. So although we would have loved to have been able to go in, look round, look at the site of the apartments and the execution site for Anne Boleyn herself, we can't do that. Nor, in fact, can we get to the top of the Queen's Steps, which was originally in the plan.
I know. Such a shame.
But at least we saw them from the
We
other
got to
side.
have a great view. We got an unexpected view.
We did, and we took some pictures, and again we'll be posting those in the show notes for you to see. So, of course, as you say, Anne was brought here. By this time, Mark Smeaton and Henry Norris were already prisoners here. What happened from this point forward?
Well, this is where Anne's composure seems to leave her a bit, and she has a moment of panic as she's arriving. And she's arriving basically into the Tower. She's met by Sir William Kingston, who's the Constable of the Tower of London. As is protocol, he comes to meet her for her, shall we say, they were calling it her stay at the Tower, which is rather ironic for us in today's term. And she asks Master Kingston, am I to go into a dungeon? And he tells her no, she's to stay in the same room she stayed, I believe, before her coronation. And it's at that moment where she says that is too good for her, and sort of drops to her knees almost, and is proclaiming her innocence at this point as well. So she has a moment where she's...
it's a very strange thing to say, isn't it? It's too good for me.
Yeah.
And I think some people wonder why she said that, almost as if she was admitting some kind of guilt, and I don't think that was the case.
No.
I think she was just overwhelmed, and I think she was just shocked. Probably.
She probably genuinely expected to go into a dungeon. I mean, she's been charged with horrendous crimes, so she's probably expecting the worst, and then to be told she's going to be still treated as a queen, staying in those same apartments, which were far better than, being in a dungeon, but obviously still being a prisoner as well. So it's that kind of, it's a bit of a double blow there, really. It's like a double-edged sword, really. But so I think it's that almost overwhelming feeling she has of, well, thank God I'm not going into a dungeon, really. I think that's what it's for. Yeah. And a sort of, maybe even part of the religious side coming out, as they were, obviously in those days, and they took that sort of thing very seriously. They believed they were to suffer penance for just about everything. So that's probably a bit of that as well, I imagine, too.
Yes, because everybody was born a sinner.
Yes.
In the Catholic faith. Yeah. So there was that kind of attitude and frame of mind that people brought to things. So I think we can easily explain why those things happened to Anne. And of course, then she was taken to the royal apartments, which sadly no longer exist. No. They were being completely destroyed. Yeah. However, if you are interested in learning more about the royal apartments at the Tower, you can either read a blog that I wrote about those a couple of years back, and there is also a virtual tour of London video series. One of those does feature a virtual tour of the Tower of London and specifically focuses on trying to recreate what those royal apartments look like. And again, there'll be links in the show notes. Now, we're not going to go into because we can't get into the tower. We're actually standing right next to the middle tower, which is the kind of the entrance today, the rather grand fortified entrance to the tower.
I don't think I've ever seen it look so quiet.
It is actually really odd, isn't it, to be here?
Odd.
The gates are closed. You can't even get onto Tower Wharf, but there is nobody around. And as the Tower, I think, is the most popular tourist destination, or certainly in the top 3.
Yeah.
It is really odd to be
Yes.
standing here, just the two of
Very
us,
much so, very much
outside
so.
the gates. What I wouldn't give to go and have a look around there right now, but unfortunately that's not what we're able to do. So what we're not going to do in this podcast is cover all the events of the next, 17 days or so. But the place that we can go and see, of course, is just outside the Tower, on the old Tower Green, the site of the scaffold in which the men who were accused with Anne were executed.
Yeah.
So can I suggest that we take a stroll? It might get a
Yes.
little noisy because, of course, this is a part of London where there's a lot of traffic, but
Yeah.
we're going to do our best to wander up to the site of the scaffold and see if we can conclude our story from there.
Brilliant.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Well, we've made our way uphill from the main entrance to the tower, and I appreciate it's a little noisy because there's a very big main road that runs between the site where the original scaffold was and the tower. But nevertheless, as I said, forgive us for that. We will do our best. But yes, we're standing, aren't we, James, right on the site of the scaffold. How does that make you feel?
Wow, it's quite moving actually to be standing exactly on the spot where 5 men lost their lives. I mean, many people lost their lives, but obviously we're focusing on the 5 men today. But yeah, and I think what's also quite sad really is obviously when everyone comes to the tower, they go straight in there, see it all. They obviously want to see where Anne Boleyn was executed, Catherine Howard, see the crown jewels. But very few, I think, come up here or even know that just over the road, if you look up here, there is also the execution spot of so many other people, where the majority of people were executed.
Yeah, and it's actually a very understated spot, isn't it? So you've got this small square of ground, and there are a few low pillars which mark kind of the outline, and we've got some plaques that list some of the important people who were executed on this date. So from a Tudor point of view, I'll read a few of those for you. We've got, of course, the Duke of Buckingham, 1521, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, 1535, closely followed by Sir Thomas More. And then some of the other ones that people will know, of course, Thomas Cromwell, 1540, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey in 1547, and Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, 1552, and Sir Thomas Wyatt following the Wyatt Rebellion in 1554. And then finally, Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, 1572. So that's quite a roll call. But what always makes me sad is that the men who died with Anne are not listed in these names.
You straight away, that's what you're going to say, because I was thinking that as well. As you said you were just about to read the names out. I was literally about to say, and none of those men are mentioned.
So let's mention them.
Let's mention them.
So we've got Sir Henry Norris,
Then you've got George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the brother of Anne.
Francis Weston, Sir Francis Weston,
Sir William Brereton.
yeah, Brereton, and then of course Mark Smeaton.
Yeah.
And of course George died first because he was a nobleman, so he had the privilege of dying first, and he died a good Christian man, which meant he made the most appropriate speech that you would have expected. And poor Mark, of course, was dragged onto the scaffold last, where it must have been dripping in blood, and one can only imagine headless bodies piled on the side.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think, it must have been like that even after the second, well, the first as well, but even the second and third, by the 5th, oh my God, it's just been
Butchery.
Absolutely, soaked in blood.
Now, of course, the site we're standing at now, this scaffold site is within some gardens, memorial gardens, and then we're surrounded by very large, quite grand really, office buildings, because we are, of course, in the City of London here, or close to the City of London here. But back in the day, this was just an open area of ground, this huge open area of ground, and thousands of people gathered, didn't they?
Yes, indeed.
And in fact, I was just at the Charterhouse yesterday, and they were talking about the execution of the Thomas Howard, where they had to specifically build a huge, tall scaffold because so many people came to witness his end. It was quite a public day out.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you, James, it's often debated, did Anne Boleyn witness the execution of her brother and those other men who died with her? Well, what do you think about that, particularly given the geography and what we know of Anne's incarceration?
I would like to think she wouldn't have seen it. But with the report coming, I believe, from Chapuis himself, I don't see why he would have made that up. That's so. I wouldn't. It wouldn't surprise me, but I would hope she would. I mean, she may have wanted to have seen her brother, who was her closest friend, see his final moments, and some of the men die as well because they were quite close, as like a final sort of, I'm with you in spirit and everything. But I would like to think she wouldn't have been made to see it.
Yeah. Yet, of course, just looking back at the tower geographically, we can see it from the spot, and all the buildings, the monument, which is here, clearly here to the First World War, and those who have fallen in it wouldn't be here. We've been this open stretch of ground. You can see the bell tower, and of course, the famous poem by Sir Thomas Wyatt, "The bell tower showed me such a sight that in my head sticks day and night." So you could quite imagine he would have been able to see what was going on. But if Anne was to have seen it, she must have been brought to this side of the tower to witness it, because it physically wouldn't have been possible from the royal apartments.
No. So, if Chapuis is right that she was made to watch to aggravate her grief, then it just makes it all the more cruel, really. And it's interesting. I would suggest people to read Thomas Wyatt's poetry, because it is incredible, and some very appropriate phrases he uses in there, like thunder rolling around the throne and everything. Very atmospheric. Obviously, Thomas Wyatt, as we know, was lucky in that he escaped, but obviously his son, as we mentioned, he's obviously the father of the younger Thomas Wyatt, who rebels later against Queen Mary I. Funny enough, for Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, and they both end up in the tower, but of this time the fates are reversed, really, I think.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, you're right. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Elder was very lucky. He was arrested, but he was later released without charge. So that was a lucky escape.
I know.
But yes, his son died here upon this very spot. So let's conclude our story. Of course, those men died before Anne. Her execution was delayed. Can you tell us a little bit about her final day and what happened to her?
Anne's final days, I mean, everything about her, once she's in the tower. I often find when you research Anne's downfall or read about it, the lead up to the arrest is almost the hardest part, because you know something's coming. But once the arrest comes, it seems to almost, for me, there's something a bit easier about it, because you see you see Anne really come into her own in that time. She becomes very courageous, and that's where the side that you really admire comes out. And particularly in those last few days, once her trial's over and done with, she becomes more settled. She accepts her fate. She knows then she's going to die, and she becomes quite fearless in a way. And she obviously is expecting to be executed, because we have the 19th of May etched into our brains. Every Tudor buff person has that etched into their brains, the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution. But she was meant to be executed on the 18th of May, and but of course it got postponed because the swordsman had not arrived from Calais. Now, for her trial to take place on the 15th and her execution meant to take place on the 18th, the swordsman would have had to have been arranged to have come over from Calais probably long before her trial had even taken place. We're probably looking, I believe Tracy Borman even suggested in her recent documentary she did, probably at the end of April, even before Anne's arrest. So really, the trial was just a show trial, really. It was set up long beforehand. And Anne, in her last 24 hours, she is very much making jokes about her situation. She tells her ladies she's going to be remembered throughout history. She'll be remembered as Queen Anne Lackhead, as Queen Anne who lost her head. And she is very much remembered as the first queen to be executed. And when the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, telling her that her execution was being postponed again, tried to comfort her and say that, it'll be over very quickly, she replies, well, I heard say the execution was very good, for putting her hands about her neck saying, and I have such a little neck, and before laughing, which, much to his rather utter bafflement, his dispatches back to Cromwell are quite humorous to read, because he just can't believe some of the stuff she's coming out with. But Anne is actually described on the day of her execution as one witness describes her as having never looked so beautiful, and another describes her as almost going to a great show, as almost having fearless, which pretty much is as Chapuis once described her as being braver than a lion, and that line couldn't be more true, particularly on that day.
Yeah,
well.
absolutely. And I've actually, Anne Boleyn's state of mind at the point of her execution is a real interest to me, because my other job is all wrapped around psychology. And I believe that actually she may have undergone what's called a sight, a suffering-induced transformational experience, which really shifted her perspective. It's kind of what we would call in modern parlance a bit of an awakening, whereby she almost reframed her whole perspective on life. Her ego falls away and she enters this state of peace that passeth all understanding, to use the biblical phrase. And I think at that point she really let go of the worldly concerns that most of us are daily preoccupied by, and she started to dwell in a different state of being. And I think that when she went out and we saw that radiance and that beauty and that peace, that's what was shining forth from her. And just if anybody is interested in that, I did recently do a podcast recording with Rebecca Larson from Tudor's Dynasty. And again, if you want to listen to me talk about that in more detail, you will find a link in the show notes. So Anne Boleyn dies with one stroke of the executioner's sword. She, of course, kneels, as would be as customary when one was executed by a sword, unlike, of course, the use of the axe, where you would lay your head upon the block. But nothing had been prepared, had it, for her burial? So what happened to her?
So she's actually put into her body's actually put into a chest, which was once made for arrows to be put into it. So there'd been no preparations or anything for a tomb or anything. And what's also quite moving is when she went to her execution that day, she most likely would have seen all the recently dug graves for the men who had recently been buried just 2 days before. Obviously her brother was buried within the chapel where she was about to go, but that would have been one of her last sights of the world, which is quite moving really to think about.
It really is. So, well, that really brings us to the end of the story. I wanted to ask you, we've come all the way from Greenwich, from the beginning of the end, if you like, to the ends of the end here at the Tower. How are you feeling? How's the day been for you?
Oh, it's quite something really to walk actually in the footsteps and to take that journey that she would have taken. Obviously, as I said, we took it at a much quicker speed and much nicer company, obviously.
and not with the threat of losing one's head at the end of it.
Absolutely. And to actually come to the memorial spot on Tower Hill as well, which often, as we were saying earlier, gets so overlooked because so many people, obviously focus very much on the Tower, the crown jewels, seeing where Anne Boleyn was executed and buried. Very few people, even in the fictional portrayals, the men often get very overlooked. So it's quite nice that we've finished here, really, I'd say, as well.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of circumstances has forced us, but it's been a good way to end it. So it's been a long day. I mean, it's been a lovely day. The sun has shone upon us. It was very moving to make this journey with you. Thank you so much for taking the time to accompany me on this journey down from Greenwich. Really, really appreciate it, James. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been so nice to see the outside of the tower with very few tourists around, because obviously we're still opening back up after COVID. We'll probably never have this experience again.
I think you're absolutely right. But before we say one final goodbye, perhaps you would like to let people know how they can maybe get in touch with you or follow the Anne Boleyn Society.
Yeah, of course. So the Anne Boleyn Society is on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. On Instagram, it's at Anne Boleyn Society, all lowercase. On Twitter, it's at Anne Boleyn SOC, because I couldn't fit the whole thing on there. But I am available to contact on all three of those on those platforms. I'd love to hear from people. So yeah, do come and follow. And if you get the chance, if you're living overseas and get the chance to come to the UK, do visit places like the Tower, Hampton Court and Heathrow, because obviously with COVID these places have suffered so much. Financial loss has been horrendous for them.
It really has been horrendous, devastating, really, hasn't it? Many people have lost their jobs.
Absolutely.
But they should also look out for you at Hampton Court, because you are a guide there, aren't you?
That's right. I'm one of the palace hosts there, so I'm fortunate to work work within the rooms and everything there. So, yeah, and I will also do a plug as well for the membership. So if you do
Please
join
do.
as a member of Historical Palaces, because a lot of people often say, when Historical Palaces put out about their financial difficulties after the first lockdown, so you think about what it's been like now, a lot of people said they wanted to help, but they live overseas, so there's so much they can do, like donation. There's a link on the website for donations, there's obviously the membership thing. Even buying something online from the shop is a huge help. So there are so many ways people can help, but obviously we know people have, it's difficult for everyone in this certain time, but yeah.
So if you do go to Hampton Court, do make sure you go and examine people's lapels and look for James's name tag and say hello.
Indeed. And do come and say hello. You'll find me talking about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, James.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you everyone. Yeah.
Psst. Before we finish the show, remember you can support my work via my Patreon programme, where various levels of sponsorship are available, starting at just $1 a month. Check out all the details of how to become a patron in the link included with this podcast. Oh, and don't forget, you can be part of my closed Facebook group where fellow time travellers like you hang out with me and each other to share some of our favourite things about visiting the UK. From great Tudor places to visit, to the best way to take your cream tea in an afternoon. From the latest travel news to the traditional Sunday roast. So don't miss out, and you can apply to join by clicking on the link in the description. So now it's back to close the show. So I do hope you enjoyed your river trip from Greenwich to the Tower of London in commemoration of the dramatic events of May 1536. But before I go, I just wanted to let you know that on Clubhouse next week, we have a very special guest. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, on Wednesday, the 19th of May, in the Tudor History Club, we will be holding a very special room to commemorate the anniversary of the execution of Anne Boleyn. And joining us as our guest for the room is none other than Tracy Borman, who, of course, has written and spoken on TV so extensively about Anne and Anne's time at the Tower. So if you want to listen to Tracy speaking, or indeed maybe even hop up on stage and have a chance to chat with her and ask her your own question live, then do make sure you're signed up to Clubhouse and that you're following the Tudor History Room. So once again, that's 7 o'clock on Wednesday, the 19th of May. We'll be joined by Tracy Borman on Clubhouse. And if you don't yet have an invitation to Clubhouse, and it is still at the moment, sadly, iPhone only, although Android is being rolled out as we speak, then you can subscribe to my blog, www.thetudortravelguide.com, and I'll be sending a very special email in advance of that room with 100 invites to the first people to sign up. So that will be your free ticket into Clubhouse and into joining the room. Okay, I hope that all makes sense. Do make sure that you look out for the show notes page associated with this podcast, where I have included some images and will also put some relevant links to everything that has been discussed during this podcast. Well, that is really all for now. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please take a moment to subscribe, like and rate this podcast so that we can spread the Tudor love. Until next time, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling.